Part 1. Introduction. Slavery has been a part of African history for centuries. The practice of servitude and slavery in Africa existed in different forms, including debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, slavery for prostitution, and enslavement of criminals. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa, with plantation slavery occurring primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and parts of West Africa. When the trans-Saharan, Indian Ocean, and Atlantic slave trades began, pre-existing African slave systems began supplying captives for slave markets outside Africa. Part 2. Forms of slavery. African slavery was categorized into indigenous slavery and export slavery, depending on whether slaves were traded beyond the continent. The slave relationships in Africa were often complex, with rights and freedoms given to individuals held in slavery and restrictions on sale and treatment by their masters. Many communities had hierarchies between different types of slaves, differentiating between those who had been born into slavery and those who had been captured through war. Chattel slavery, where the slave is treated as the property of the owner, was also prevalent in some parts of Africa. Domestic slavery, where slaves would work primarily in the house of the master but retain some freedoms, was another common form of slavery in Africa. Pawnship, or debt bondage slavery, was a common form of collateral in West Africa. Part 3. Legacy of slavery. Slavery was a part of the economic structure of African societies for many centuries, although the extent varied. The importance of domestic plantation slavery increased during the 19th century due to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Many African states that were dependent on the international slave trade reoriented their economies towards legitimate commerce worked by slave labor. Slavery in contemporary Africa is still practiced despite it being illegal. The legacy of slavery in Africa is complex and continues to influence the continent's social and economic structures. The trans-Saharan slave trade, Indian Ocean slave trade, and Atlantic slave trade greatly impacted the history of slavery in Africa. With the rise of these slave trades, many pre-existing local African slave systems began to supply captives for slave markets outside of Africa. Slavery in Africa was categorized into indigenous slavery and export slavery, depending on whether or not slaves were traded beyond the continent. Debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, slavery for prostitution, and enslavement of criminals were all practiced in various parts of Africa. Plantation slavery also occurred, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. The importance of domestic plantation slavery increased during the 19th century due to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. The forms of slavery in Africa were closely related to kinship structures. Slaves were a permanent part of a master's lineage, and the children of slaves could become closely connected with the larger family ties. Children of slaves born into families could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society, even to the level of chief in some instances. However, stigma often remained attached, and there could be strict separations between slave members of a kinship group and those related to the master. Chattel slavery, where the slave is treated as the property of the owner, was a common form of slavery in the Nile River Valley, much of the Sahel, and North Africa. Evidence is incomplete about the extent and practices of chattel slavery throughout much of the rest of the continent prior to written records by Arab or European traders. Domestic slavery, where slaves worked primarily in the house of the master, but retained some freedoms, was another form of slavery in Africa. Slaves could own the profits from their labor and could marry and pass the land on to their children in many cases. Pawnship, or debt bondage slavery, involved the use of people as collateral to secure the repayment of debt. Despite the fact that slavery has been illegal in Africa for many years, contemporary slavery is still practiced in some parts of the continent. The International Labor Organization estimates that approximately 9.2 million people are currently victims of forced labor in Africa. Slavery in Africa remains a complex and multifaceted issue, with a long and complicated history that has shaped the continent's social, economic, and political landscape. Abolition and modern slavery. The Atlantic slave trade, which was largely abolished by the end of the 19th century, was one of the most significant historical events in the forced migration and enslavement of Africans. However, slavery and the slave trade continued in various forms throughout the 20th century and into the present day. Despite being illegal in most African countries, modern forms of slavery still exist, including forced labor, debt bondage, and human trafficking. 38. In recent years, efforts have been made to combat modern slavery in Africa through legislation, law enforcement, and international cooperation. However, these efforts have been met with challenges, including corruption, lack of resources, and cultural acceptance of certain forms of servitude. Additionally, poverty and lack of education can leave individuals vulnerable to exploitation and enslavement. Overall, the history of slavery in Africa is complex and varied, with many forms of servitude existing for centuries. While the transatlantic slave trade is often the most well-known aspect of this history, it is important to recognize the long-standing traditions of slavery within African societies and the ongoing struggle to eradicate modern forms of slavery.